The fundamental poetic action which structures this poem, as I hope is apparent, that fundamental action which is worthy of representation, in my view, characterizes poetic knowledge in general, is the action of self-revision, an act of continuous remembering and self-reconstruction in the presence of the source of poetic discourse herself, characterized by forgetfulness, too happy in her happiness. The source, as poetry, Philomela, most musical, most melancholy, does not remember, and her voice excites anger in her devoted poet, because her voice enforces his memory of the atrocity which drove her speaking into existence, which made her a singer. It is the business of the speaker in the poem. The poem, as I have said, is not poetry, but an account of regulated relationship to it, to recover the truth of the story about history in order to complete his humanity as poetry discovers it, and such he does in the presence of the Philomela. The peculiar present tense with which the poem begins. Now note that. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. Notice there's trouble about that present tense. It's a mind describing the ongoing of a mind, right? And incidentally, it's a mind that gives no account of how the poem is written. That is to say, if the mind gives an account of the mind, then the question arises, how is this account mediated to the text? Do you understand? There's an elision, a strange moment in this present tense, very common in our poetry, and we shall find it in Yeats's I Walk Through the Long Schoolroom Questioning, in which the mind is represented as aware of its own processes and reporting them somehow to the world of which we are a part. Do you follow? There is a kind of alienated strangeness about the practice of this self-registration, of which the index is the form of the lyric present we find here. My heart aches and the drowsy numbness pains my sense is the present tense of self-awareness, which intends at the moment of experience to discover its cause, as though of hemlock I had drunk, the counter moment of consciousness, the moment of its death. In the present tense of this poem, consciousness continuously constructs its own image for the purpose of coming into its own presence. The language of this poem is obviously strange. Melodious plot, almost as weird as defunctive music, which is my all-time favorite. The language of this poem is strange, an elaborated instance of poetic language as such, determined by the fact that the speaker is addressing the Philomela. That's what she wants to hear. Source of poetic language, as the language of Sir Patrick Spens, is determined by the fact that the speaker is addressing the folk, to whom he supplies the language which they elicit from him, or as any speech at all is determined by the terms on which the hearer, who is addressed, grants speech to the speaker. The quality of poetic speech is a function of the voice in the self, elicited by the demands, do you understand, of the voice of the other. We adjust our speaking to the capacities for understanding or to the social decorum by which we index the hearer of our speech. Therefore, poetic language will be indexed in accord with the figuration of the person addressed, in this case the Philomela. All poetic languages, as I have said, are artificial and therefore strange because the person addressed who gives rise to them is not a natural person. They are languages which bring language to mind. Language is, of course, the sea in which we swim. Poetic languages make us like fish who have suddenly learned about water and must remember how to swim. Poetic languages, always artificial, produce consciousness of language and therefore are inherently occasions of self-revision with respect to language. They produce an alienation by which we become conscious through consciousness of artificiality, of the nature of natural language, and in that sense the nature of truth. But not all poetic languages are artificial in the same way. Some construct the likeness to natural languages, and some, as does the language of the phoenix and the turtle, as does the language of this ode to the nightingale, construct the likeness of their own making, their artificial nature, and foreground their difference from natural language. If you call a bird light-winged dryad of the trees, at the Garden of Charles Brown, a melodious plot, you are not talking natural language. You get the world that is full of song, melodious plot, right? But the singer, the subject self, source of the song, is absent from the discourse. Melodious is what a bird is, plot is where birds sit, but where is the bird? The bird is elided. The characteristic of poetic language in Keats's Ode to the Nightingale throughout is the use of figuration which elides, removes, right, the subject self, the agent of the effect of which the figure is an account. As in the expression dryad of the trees, the grieving woman is also absent. This figure of partialization is technically known as metonymy. M-E-T-O-N-Y-M-Y. Metonymy. It is the counterfigure to metaphor, and is very important to have in your among your speculative instruments. This figure of partialization is technically known as metonymy, and is the characteristic figure of Philomelan language. Full-throated ease. Well, full-throatedness is a characteristic of a singer, right? Ease is the effect of such a song, but where's the singer? The metonymy takes the part for the whole, the full-throatedness, or the ease induced. That's the effect for the cause, but the whole and the cause are missing. Sunburnt mirth. Well, somebody must be sunburned and happy, but nobody is there. No one is home in the expression sunburnt mirth, right? You have the qualities, and you have the affect, but you don't have the person. Warm south. That alludes to a wine that derives from the place called the south, that has the effect on the palate of warmth, but the wine is not at home. That is to say, we have the space in which it occurs, the consequence which it effects, but not the fact itself. Blushful hypocrite and so on. Do you understand? That is the characteristic of the language that Philomela induces. It is a language that forgets the subject self. And it is the recovery from this discourse of elision or deletion of the subject self that is effected by the self-revision which this speaker accomplishes in the course of the text of the Ode to the Nightingale. It's the language which this poem works through and dismisses at the end with a gesture when, in the last stanza of the poem, the Philomela becomes a bird and flies away because a bell has been rung. And that bell is the naming of the fact of the word. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell. And with the naming of the medium of representation, the bird flies away. And that particular form of figuration is exhausted. And the disposition toward it is exhausted as well. The bird flies away, stanza 8, past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. We hear the fading of the plaintive anthem. Notice that expression, line 75, you heard it before, the anthem genre, the anthem index in the Phoenix and the Turtle. We hear the fading of the plaintive anthem, line 75, as we heard also in the word requiem, the language of Shakespeare's Phoenix and Turtle, articulating itself toward reason's conclusion in that poem. All poetic languages are the language of a class, not the class of the poet. That's an important axiom which you can test against your experience. It may be right or it may be wrong. It seems to me correct. All poetic languages are the class, language of a class, not the class of the poet. As the language of the class, they have a relationship to time different from the language of the individual who dies. Why should poetry solicit the language of a class? Because a class has a different relationship to time than does an individual. The undying class, let's say the bourgeoisie, which, God willing, we shall never be rid of, supplies Keats' poetic language with the relationship to time of a class of speakers whom he regards, not the bourgeoisie, as the primordial poets of his language. By and large, the collectivity which Keats's language imitates are the speakers of Shakespeare's poems and plays. Keats talks a literary language. He regards his tribe as the tribe of Shakespeare. It's not a folk, it's the peculiar kind of tribe that he models his language upon and from the collectivity of which he undertakes to derive its duration in time. Therefore, Keats's poetic language is singularly a language consciousness of which constitutes consciousness of poetic language itself, adorned and empowered by its artificiality. As his address in this poem is to the source of action, poetic action, the Philomela, and enforces consciousness of the condition, forgetfulness of cause, on which one can have that kind of creativity, so also his practice of Shakespearean speech, imitated as a poetic language, enforces consciousness of the entailments of the possession of that kind of discourse. What are the entailments of possession of discourse of that kind? That eliding discourse, that discourse which leaves out the subject self, that discourse which makes discourse conscious of itself because it is in imitation of an artificial discourse and knows its own alienation from the natural language. Now, I've already noted that the language which the speaker speaks in the presence of the Philomela, the Nightingale, is characterized by the elision of the subject consciousness. Such elision or suppression or erasure, this leaving out Philomela's forgetfulness of the atrocity done to her, which brings to mind the atrocity of history in the speaker, and by her a forgetfulness which is her comfort and perhaps also her revenge, gives confident access to the world as apparently natural language does not. The question that arises is whether the world obtained by these means, by means of the address to the Philomela, is in fact a world worth having. Keats makes the judging of this question by his self-revising speaker a moment of profundity. It occurs in stanzas 4 and 5 of the poem, the arithmetic center of the text, and the action is accomplished by the elision of the subject self who acts. The line is line 35, the last of the following sequence which opens stanza 4. These lines register consent to seduction by the archetype and then consummation. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards, and then the great on a line without a fellow in the world, already with thee. Tender is the night, a line divided between two halves, in which the subject self disappears, disappears between the two arithmetically equivalent phrases, 5 and 5, with thee, tender is the night. Here, the present tense of consciousness deepens and becomes identical with its medium of self-presence, which is language, viewless, subject to poetic process, which is not realized in any poem or particular actualization, poesy. And poesy has wings because the speaker is now moved by and into the domain of the bird, not his art, but the art, which dwells in the dark shadowed center of the tree. Above all, the consciousness of artifice is lost, and with it the difference between language and the world. Loss of difference between signifier and signified, already with thee, tender is the night, which in the end this speaker judges to be a loss which is intolerable. Already with thee tender in the night is the night. Already in this line means always already. No space has been crossed, distance and no space between, as Shakespeare writes it in The Phoenix and the Turtle. There is no subject person remaining to define space or time. Consciousness's medium language has ceased to be different from consciousness's subject, the self. The memory of the person has become identical with great memory. Look at line 36, where haply means not in actuality, but in inactual probability. Correlatively, the I cannot see, which introduces stanza 5 at line 41, followed by the I can only guess of line 43, registers a loss of the power to will, the consequence of the wrong use of the will at line 31, I will fly to thee. Underneath the difference-based structure in this poem of Keats, the life structure of this poem now before us, which note gives life to our relationship to one another at this very moment. Do not look beyond the moment of our relationship too rapidly. We come together, all of you, on the ground of this poem. It is a principal relationship, like the song of the Philomela. Underneath the difference-based, difference-based structure in this poem of Keats, the life structure of the poem now before us, and between us now, and difference in each of us now by reason of its self-sameness, by reason of its being the self-same song, line 65. Underneath this difference-based structure, there is in Keats' poem a death structure which appears in the last line of the stanza. In each case, shadows numberless, line 10, forest dim, line 20, verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways, line 40, the murmurous haunts of flies, line 50, perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. This death structure is a labyrinth with no way out, or a way out that is mystified, winding, mossy ways. This labyrinth is the counterstructure to natural death and the perplexity it arouses in mind. The fullest actualization of the labyrinth of which I speak is in the 5th stanza. It is the labyrinthine ecstasy of the identification with the archetype. In the Phoenix and the Turtle, it was called the Phoenix Nest. As you will remember, death is now the Phoenix Nest. The counterstructure to this death structure is the poem itself, in which we are not lost, the path always open from beginning to end. The self-same song, remember, that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth. Keats' speaker chooses against identification with the source, already with thee. And in doing so, he chooses the world which supervenes or becomes present in the poem in the last stanza, that world dimensional into which the nightingale, signifying difference, by her departure, disappears at the sound of the tolling of the bell of the word. The mind becomes conscious of its own medium and therefore distant from it. This last judgment constitutes an ethical self-revision. And it is delegated to you and me by the question at the end of the poem, do I wake or sleep? One of the effects of that question is to delegate us, to us, a judgment as to whether the speaker has effected a self-revision that constitutes wakefulness or not. As one might say, am I right or wrong? To recapitulate, from the beginning of the poem, the self-revising speaker enacts speech in reciprocity with the source of utterance, in this case, Philomela, the nightingale. The speaker's action is directed, as the poem is, toward the overcoming of the problematicity of source, its ethical forgetfulness of its own origins. The practice of that action is the bridging of consciousness to mind in a present tense of consciousness. The speaker, as Orphic journeyer, then seeks a world below the deep-delved earth. This earth is a death system, a sense labyrinth in which consciousness is lost. There is a counter-labyrinth, the other world unseen, the dark truth of unity with the archetype in the night tree of myth. This uncovers the name of Ruth, and the name of Ruth in turn uncovers the bell forlorn. The bell forlorn uncovers the medium of discourse, the word, in the medium of discourse brings the speaker back to that difference from the source of discourse, which is the judgment of an ethical kind that the poem finally delegates for ratification to the reader. What then, ladies and gentlemen, is poetic knowledge? Poetic knowledge, on the authority of this poem and on the authority of the other poems we study, is the capacity to address the source and to return with three competences or powers. The first is access to the great mind, which joins individual consciousness to the living and the dead. The second is the capacity to understand the blindness of the source, and in particular, its peculiar blindness to its own origins, the Philomelan forgetfulness. This second capacity is often expressed as secure knowledge of the artifactuality of human affairs, of which the poem is a type. The third power is the freedom to remain in regulated and nurturant relationship to that source. In this last labor, the poem is text, the woven thing figured in Philomela's message to Procne from prison, is designed to participate. In the next lecture, we turn to a great didactic utterance of a master of this kind of knowledge of which I speak, Emily Dickinson.